The first thing I noticed was her hand, not her face, not her voice, not the careful brightness she'd put on for the doorway. Her hand wrapped around mine, holding on with a strength that didn't match the smile above it. I had come back for nothing more than a coat. A gray wool coat I'd worn to dinner the night before, and somehow left draped over the back of a dining chair, the way I leave things sometimes now. The way a woman in her 79th year occasionally walks out of a room still half thinking about whatever she was thinking about when she walked in. I'd telephoned ahead. Olivia had said, "Of course, Dorothy, come by whenever you like. I'll be home all afternoon." Nothing in her voice had warned me. But when she opened the door of that house on the hill above Hampton Road, the house Nathan had bought for her almost 20 years ago, with its wide veranda and its view down toward the working cranes of the harbor, she didn't simply hand me the coat. She pulled me into an embrace I wasn't expecting, held it a beat longer than an embrace between a woman and her mother-in-law usually lasts, and when she finally let go and took my hand instead, I felt it. A fine, continuous tremor, the kind you feel in an old engine left running too long, the kind a body produces when it's been holding something in for days, and the holding has started to cost something. "You're freezing," I said, because that was the easiest thing to say, the polite explanation a person reaches for first. "Am I?" she said, and laughed, a small laugh that didn't go anywhere near her eyes. We stood in that doorway for what felt like a long while, though it was probably no more than a minute. The afternoon light was doing that particular Fremantle thing it does in early autumn, turning gold and then quickly gray as a bank of cloud came in off the Indian Ocean. And somewhere down the hill, a ship's horn sounded, long and low, the way it has sounded over that town since before either of us was born. Olivia kept holding my hand. I kept waiting for her to say something that would explain it. She didn't. She fetched the coat herself, rather than letting me step further into the house, which struck me even then, though I told myself it was only courtesy, only her trying to spare an old woman the walk down the hallway. She helped me into it on the veranda, smoothed the collar the way you'd settle a child's coat before sending them out into weather, and then, with her hand resting flat against my arm for just a moment too long, she said the only sentence in that whole strange visit that wasn't really about the coat at all. "Please don't read this until you're home." I felt the small square weight of an envelope settle into the coat pocket as she said it. I didn't see her place it there. I only felt it arrive, the way you feel a stone dropped into a deep pond, a small disturbance on the surface, and then nothing, the depth swallowing whatever had been thrown. "Read what, love?" I said, and she only shook her head, already stepping back toward the door, already rearranging her face into the pleasant, ordinary expression she'd worn since she opened it. "Drive safe, Dorothy. Tell Nathan I'll see him at 6. And that was all. No argument, no raised voice. Nothing a stranger passing on the footpath would have looked twice at. Just a woman standing very still in her own doorway, watching her husband's mother walk down the garden path to her car, her arms folded tightly across herself the way you fold yourself when you're trying to keep something inside your own body from escaping. I want you to understand something before I go any further with this story, because it matters to everything that follows. I have lived 78 years. I have buried a husband. I have raised a son. I have sat through performances by students who could not find a single correct note in an entire scale, and performances by students who made me weep without warning in the middle of a Tuesday lesson. In all that time, I have learned exactly one reliable thing about silence in a family. It is never empty. It is the loudest sound there is, if you know how to listen for it. And I drove home that afternoon down Marine Terrace, past the limestone terraces that have stood along that street since the colony was barely out of its infancy, with the strange, unplaced weight of that envelope sitting against my hip like a stone in my pocket. And I knew, the way you know weather is changing before the first drop falls, that something in my family had been quietly wrong for a very long time, and that I, somehow, had just been handed the first piece of learning what it was. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope, let me tell you who I am, because a story like this one only makes sense if you understand the woman it happened to. My name is Dorothy Sinclair, though for the first 24 years of my life I was Dorothy Pemberton. And before that, in the brief stretch of childhood nobody quite remembers clearly, I was simply Dot, the second of 4 children raised in a weatherboard house in East Fremantle, close enough to the river that you could hear the working boats at all hours and close enough to the old timber yards that my father, who spent 30 years of his life as a wharf clerk, came home most evenings smelling of creosote and salt. I trained as a pianist before I trained as anything else. There was an upright piano in our front room that had belonged to my grandmother, badly out of tune for most of my childhood because nobody could afford to have it seen to properly, and I taught myself scales on it before I ever had a lesson, simply because the sound of it, even imperfect, felt like the only beautiful thing in a house that otherwise smelled of fish and hard work and the particular tiredness of people who never quite got ahead. By the time I was 16, I was good enough that a teacher in West Perth took me on without charging my parents a fee, and by 20, I was giving lessons of my own in the front room of that same weatherboard house, charging the neighborhood children 2 shillings an hour and feeling for the first time in my life like a person who had built something rather than simply survived something. I married Arthur Sinclair the year I turned 24. Arthur was a harbor pilot, one of the men who climbed the rope ladders onto the great bulk carriers and container ships as they came in off the roads, guiding vessels 20 times the size of our house through the narrow mouth of the harbor and up to the wharves. A job that required a steadiness of nerve I never fully understood until I watched him do it once, just once, from the deck of a pilot launch on an anniversary he insisted I see for myself. He was a quiet man, Arthur. Not cold, never cold, but quiet in the particular way of men who have spent their working lives trusting their own judgment in conditions where a moment's hesitation could cost lives. And that quietness carried into our marriage in a way I came, eventually, to treasure rather than resent. We bought the house on Ellen Street the year Nathan was born, a narrow limestone cottage with thick walls that kept it cool in February, and a back garden just large enough for a lemon tree and a clothesline. And I have lived in that house for 54 years now, through Arthur's whole working life and most of mine, through Nathan's childhood and his own marriage, and through the 11 years since Arthur's heart finally gave out on a Tuesday morning while he was watering that same lemon tree, the hose still running when I found him, the water making a small, dark river across the limestone path that I still, on certain mornings, see in my mind exactly as it was. I tell you all of this not because an old woman likes to talk about herself, though I expect there's some truth in that too, but because you need to understand that I am not a fanciful woman. I did not imagine the tremor in Olivia's hand. I did not imagine the way Nathan, my own son, had grown so quietly distant from all of us over the better part of a decade, that I had genuinely begun to believe, as so many of us had, that something fundamental in him had simply changed. That belief, it turned out, was the single most important misunderstanding of my entire life, and I did not yet know it as I drove home that afternoon with the engine of my old Holden ticking over evenly and the envelope sitting in my coat pocket like a held breath. A quick word before we go any further. If a story like this one is starting to settle into you, the kind of family story you find yourself thinking about hours later while you're doing the washing up or driving somewhere with the radio off, I'd love it if you let me know in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. There's something rather lovely about knowing this story is reaching kitchens and lounge rooms and night shifts in places I'll never see myself. If you haven't yet, do subscribe, because there's more of the Sinclair family still to come, and a like helps this story find its way to someone else who might need a quiet evening with a family that feels a little like their own. Now, back to that envelope. I let myself into my own house just after 4 o'clock, hung the recovered coat on its usual peg by the door, and made myself do something I am normally quite incapable of, which is to sit down with a pot of tea before opening anything at all. I have never in my life been a woman who could leave a wrapped parcel unopened on Christmas morning while breakfast was made, and yet I sat in my good chair by the window for the better part of 20 minutes, the envelope on the side table beside me, my tea going cold, simply because some part of me already understood that whatever was inside that envelope was going to change the shape of an afternoon, possibly the shape of a great deal more than an afternoon, and I wanted, foolishly perhaps, just a little more time on the other side of not knowing. When I finally opened it, my hands were steadier than Olivia's had been, though my heart, I'll admit, was doing something closer to what hers must have been doing all day. I expected, if I'm honest, a letter, a confession of some kind, perhaps, given the strangeness of the delivery. What I found instead was something far stranger than a letter, though there was a letter folded in among it all. There were photocopied bank statements with years and account names I didn't recognize, the figures on some of them large enough to make me set the page down for a moment and simply breathe. There were what looked like minutes from meetings, typed up formally, the kind of document a company secretary produces with Nathan's company letterhead at the top of several of them. A heading I knew well because I'd watched him design it himself 20 years ago at this very table, sketching the little stylized wave that still sits above the words, Lewin Marine Engineering. There were handwritten notes in a hand I didn't immediately recognize, but would soon come to know intimately. And tucked among the photocopies, in an envelope of its own, smaller, slightly creased at one corner, as though it had been carried in a bag for some time before finally being placed where it now sat, was a letter in handwriting I knew at once, because I had watched that handwriting form. Letter by careful letter, on a kitchen blackboard, when its writer was no older than 6. It was from Emily, my granddaughter. 29 years old now, though in my mind she is forever somewhere between 6 and 16. Forever a girl with scraped knees climbing the lemon tree in my back garden or sitting cross-legged on my piano stool insisting, at age 8, that she would one day play Chopin better than I ever had. A promise I am pleased to say she very nearly kept. I did not read the whole letter that first evening. I want to be honest with you about that, because there is no use pretending an old woman's courage is greater than it actually was. I read the first page, in which Emily explained, in the calm and careful language of someone who had rehearsed the words many times before writing them down, that she had spent the better part of the last 8 months helping her father go through old archive boxes from the early years of the business, boxes that had sat untouched in a storage unit out near the Fremantle traffic bridge since before she was even born. Boxes nobody had wanted to deal with because dealing with them meant remembering a period of the family's life that everyone had quietly, collectively, agreed not to discuss. And there, in among invoices and superseded contracts and the kind of paperwork that accumulates around any small business across 30 years, she had found something that didn't fit the story any of us had been telling ourselves. I read that first page twice, and then I did something I am not at all proud of. I put the rest of the letter back in its envelope, set the whole bundle on the side table, and went to bed without finishing my tea, telling myself I would look at the rest of it in the morning when my mind was clearer. Sleep, of course, had other ideas. I lay in that bed Arthur and I had shared for nearly 50 years, listening to the same harbor sounds I have listened to my whole adult life, the distant grind of a crane, the occasional deep note of a ship's horn somewhere out past the breakwater, and I found myself thinking not about the documents at all, not yet, but about Nathan, about the boy he had been, and the man he had somehow, somewhere along the way, become. I remembered when he was perhaps 9 years old, building a model of a tugboat out of balsa wood at this very kitchen table for weeks on end, sanding each piece until his fingers were raw, refusing every offer of help because he wanted, he said, to be the one who actually did it. I remembered him at 18, walking down to the harbor every single morning of one long, hot summer to watch the pilot boats come and go, not because he wanted to follow his father's exact path, but because he had already decided, with the particular certainty of the very young, that he wanted his whole life to be built around the sea his father loved, just built differently, built from the engineering side rather than the piloting side. I remembered the day he opened Lewin Marine Engineering in a single rented office above a chandlery on Cliff Street, 26 years old and terrified and proud in equal measure, and how Arthur had stood in that little office with his hand on Nathan's shoulder and said simply, "Well done, son," in a voice that carried more in it than most men managed to say in an hour of speaking. And then I thought about the Nathan of the last 10 years. The Nathan who came to Sunday dinners and sat slightly apart from the conversation, even when he was sitting right at the table. The Nathan who had grown, somewhere along the way, careful in a manner that felt less like discretion and more like distance, who answered questions about the business with shorter and shorter sentences, who I had once, God forgive me, described to my oldest friend Margaret over a cup of tea as a man who seemed to have somehow stepped half a pace back from his own family, without anyone quite noticing the moment it happened. I had believed, along with everyone else, that this was simply who Nathan had become. That success, or stress, or simply the slow erosion of middle age had taken something warm out of him and left something more guarded in its place. I had grieved that change quietly, the way you grieve the slow loss of someone who is still standing right in front of you. And I had never once, not for a single moment in 10 years, considered that the change I was grieving might not have been a change in who Nathan was at all, but a change in what Nathan had been carrying, and carrying entirely alone. That thought kept me awake until well past midnight, and when I finally did sleep, it was the kind of shallow, restless sleep where the mind keeps working even while the body rests, and I woke before dawn with a clarity I had not felt in years. I was going to read every single page in that envelope, and then I was going to find out, properly and finally, what my son had actually been doing with himself for the last decade of his life. Before I take you further into what I found that next morning, I want to pause here for a moment, because I think this part of the story deserves a little context, and not just for the sake of curiosity. Fremantle is not simply the backdrop to my life. It has shaped, I think, the very way I see loyalty and silence, and what families owe one another. This town was founded in 1829, named for a young naval captain called Charles Fremantle, who sailed his ship into the mouth of the Swan River and claimed the western coast of this continent for the colony before the first official settlers had even arrived from England. The very oldest building still standing in the whole of Western Australia sits less than a 15-minute walk from my front door, a small limestone structure called the Round House, built in 1831, originally as the colony's jail, long before there were proper roads or proper anything in this part of the world. I have walked past it more times than I could possibly count, and I have always found something quietly instructive in the fact that the oldest surviving structure in an entire state was built not to celebrate anything, but to hold things that were difficult, things the new colony did not yet know how to deal with any other way. 100 years after that, this same small port town became one of the largest Allied submarine bases anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere during the Second World War, a fact most visitors walking along our harbor today would never guess, looking out at the quiet pleasure boats and the fishing trawlers. Beneath the surface of an ordinary-looking town, extraordinary things were happening. Things kept necessarily quiet at the time, things that only became part of the town's known history many years later, once the danger that required the silence had finally passed. I think about that sometimes, now more than ever. How a place can hold an entire hidden chapter beneath its ordinary daily rhythm, and how the people living through that chapter often have no idea in the moment that they are living through anything at all unusual. They are simply doing what feels necessary at the time, in the conditions they find themselves in, and it is only later, sometimes decades later, that the full shape of what happened becomes visible to anyone looking back at it. I did not know it yet, that early morning with the kettle on and the harbor fog still sitting low over Ellen Street. But I was about to learn that my own family had been quietly living through a hidden chapter of its own, one that had started not with cruelty or deceit in the way those words usually frighten us, but with a son trying in his own clumsy and ultimately costly way to protect the people he loved from a danger most of us never even knew had come close enough to touch us. if you're still with me. That means a great deal to this old woman, more than you probably realize. I'd love it if you took a moment to hit the like button before we continue, simply because it helps stories like this one reach the people who might be sitting somewhere tonight, wondering about a quiet, distant person in their own family, wondering if there's more to the story than anyone has told them. If that's you, welcome, and please do subscribe, because the Sinclair family's story is only just beginning to unfold, and I promise you it goes somewhere worth staying for. I made my tea properly that morning, the way I always have. The pot warmed first the way my mother taught me, and I sat back down in the same good chair by the window, and I finished Emily's letter from beginning to end. What I read there did not describe a man who had grown cold. It described a man who, almost a decade earlier, had been told quietly by his accountant that a major client, a long-established shipping contractor that represented nearly half of Lewin Marine Engineering's annual work, had gone into sudden administration after what the accountant called an unforeseeable collapse in contract financing, the kind of thing that happens occasionally in an industry built on enormous vessels and even more enormous sums of money, the kind of collapse that takes everyone downstream of it by surprise. Nathan's company had completed work that client could no longer pay for. The shortfall, according to the figures Emily had carefully copied out, was substantial enough that it threatened not only the business itself, but everyone who depended on it, including, as it turned out, several members of our own family whose own smaller businesses were quietly intertwined with Nathan's in ways I had never fully understood. And rather than let that collapse ripple outward and take down everyone connected to it, rather than let his own mother learn that her son's company and possibly her own modest savings tied up in it were suddenly at risk, Nathan had made a decision. He had taken on debt no one else knew about. He had quietly restructured agreements with relatives in ways that protected them while exposing himself. He had, according to one handwritten note in that bundle, in his own handwriting, written something I have not been able to forget since I first read it. The note simply said, in his familiar, slightly slanted hand, "Better they think less of me than lose what they've built." I sat with that single line for a long time that morning, the tea growing cold for the second time in 2 days, and I understood, with a kind of grief I had not expected, that I had spent 10 years quietly mourning the loss of a warm and open son, never once imagining that the very coldness I had been grieving was, in fact, the most loving thing he had ever done. I did not yet understand all of it. I did not understand why Olivia's hands had trembled the way they had, or why this revelation, 8 years after the fact, had suddenly surfaced now, in an envelope smuggled into the pocket of an old woman's forgotten coat. I did not yet understand the full reach of what Nathan had protected, or from whom, or at what continuing cost to himself. There was a great deal more in that bundle of documents I had not yet had the courage to examine closely, references to property arrangements that predated even this crisis, mentions of relatives I had not expected to see named at all, hints of an older history beneath the more recent one Emily had described. But I knew, sitting there in my good chair with the harbor fog finally beginning to lift outside my window, that I was no longer simply a grandmother who had forgotten a coat. I had become, without ever intending to, the one person in this entire family who was about to learn the truth before anyone else did. And I understood, even then, even that early in the story, that learning a truth like this one is never really the end of anything. It is only ever the beginning. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person once they understand they are no longer simply living their life, but investigating it. And that quiet settled over me somewhere around the second week after I opened that envelope. I had not yet told Nathan I knew anything. I had not told Olivia either, though I suspected from the way she had looked at me in that doorway that some part of her was waiting, almost hoping, for the conversation that would eventually have to come. I had certainly not told Emily, though I had read her letter so many times by then that I could have recited whole paragraphs of it from memory, The careful, deliberate handwriting of a young woman who had clearly spent a long time deciding exactly how much truth to put on paper and exactly how much to leave for a conversation she did not yet feel brave enough to have herself. What I had done in those 2 weeks was something far more in keeping with the woman I actually am, which is to say I had begun, quietly and methodically, to understand. Let me take you back a little further than the envelope, because I think you need to understand where my own particular stubbornness comes from before I tell you what I did with it. I grew up the second of 4 children in a house where money was never spoken about directly, only felt, the way you feel a change in weather pressing against the windows before the rain actually arrives. My father, Walter Pemberton, worked 31 years as a clerk on the Fremantle wharves, a job that paid steadily but never generously, and my mother, Joan, took in mending and later, when I was perhaps 10, began cleaning 2 mornings a week for a doctor's family up in South Fremantle, work she never once described to us children as cleaning, always as helping out, a small dignity she insisted on preserving even within the walls of her own kitchen. I remember, with absolute clarity, a single winter when I was perhaps 11 years old, when my father came home 3 weeks running without his usual pay packet. The wharves having gone quiet after a dispute I was far too young to understand at the time, and I remember my mother doing something I have never forgotten in all the years since. She did not tell us children there was no money. She simply began serving slightly smaller portions, slightly more bread and slightly less of everything else, framing each meal as a particular favorite she'd decided to make that week. And it was not until I was an adult myself, hearing my own mother finally speak of it decades later, that I understood what that winter had actually cost her, and how completely she had hidden that cost from 4 children who had no idea at the time that they were eating less so that none of them would ever have to feel the fear their parents were feeling. I tell you that story because I have thought about it more in the last fortnight than I have in 50 years, and because I think it is the reason that, when I finally understood what Nathan had done, my first response was not the anger I might have expected from myself. It was recognition. I had grown up in a house built, in its own quiet way, on exactly the same kind of protective silence my son had chosen to build his own family around, decades later, on a different street, in a different decade, but built from the very same instinct, the instinct that says it is better to carry a weight yourself than to let the people you love feel its full force. That recognition is what carried me, eventually, past the second week of quiet reading, and into the part of this story where I stopped simply understanding what had happened and started trying to understand whether it was finished. A short pause here, if you'll allow an old woman to catch her breath for a moment. If any of this is striking close to something in your own family, a parent who carried more than anyone realized, a quiet relative whose distance you only understood properly years later, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. These stories mean far more to me when I know they're landing somewhere real. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because there is still a great deal more of the Sinclair family ahead of us, and if this has held your attention this far, I think you'll want to see where it goes. Now, let me tell you about the family I actually built and the family Nathan married into. Arthur and I had 2 children, though I have only spoken of Nathan so far, and I should correct that now. Our daughter Carolyn, 2 years younger than Nathan, lives these days in Albany, 4 hours south of us along the coast, where she runs a small second-hand bookshop with a cafe attached to it, the kind of business that survives more on love than on profit and has done for nearly 20 years. Caroline and Nathan were closest children in the particular fierce way of siblings, only 2 years apart, and less close as adults, the way distance and different lives so often quietly thin a closeness that once felt unbreakable. It was in the documents Emily had gathered that I first learned Caroline's bookshop had nearly failed entirely during that same difficult period, almost a decade ago now, when a renovation of the building above her shop had gone disastrously over budget at almost exactly the same moment her own modest savings, which I had always understood to be held safely with a respected local bank, turned out to have been invested on the advice of a financial advisor long since vanished from the industry entirely, in precisely the kind of high-risk maritime contracting fund that collapsed alongside the very client whose failure had threatened Nathan's company. I had not known any of this. Caroline had not known, until reading Emily's own careful summary years later, that the unexpected and generous loan which had allowed her to complete that renovation and keep her little shop afloat had not, as she'd always believed, come from a business support scheme through her local council. It had come from her brother, structured quietly through a solicitor neither of them had ever met in person, specifically so that Caroline would never feel the particular shame of being saved by Nathan, rather than by some impersonal, faceless authority that owed her nothing and therefore cost her nothing in pride. I sat with that piece of the story for a long time too, because it explained something that had puzzled me for years without my ever quite noticing the puzzle. Caroline had always spoken of Nathan in the years since with a careful, slightly formal warmth, the warmth of someone grateful to a system rather than to a person, and I had always assumed that was simply how their adult relationship had settled. Two siblings living different lives in different towns, fond of each other, but no longer truly close. It had never once occurred to me that Caroline's gratitude had simply been pointed in the wrong direction the entire time, toward an institution that had never actually helped her at all, while the brother who had truly saved her business sat across the table from her at family gatherings, saying nothing, accepting nothing, wanting nothing in return except, perhaps, the simple relief of knowing she was safe. I want to tell you now about how Olivia came into this family, because I think it matters to everything that follows, and because I owe her, in this telling, a fairness I am not sure I extended to her fully enough in the moment all those years ago. Olivia and Nathan met at a maritime heritage fundraiser held at the old commissariat building down near the harbor, the kind of formal evening event neither of them would normally have attended. Nathan there because his company had sponsored part of the restoration work being celebrated. Olivia there because she was, even then, working her way up through the curatorial staff of the museum housed in that very building, a young woman with an extraordinary memory for maritime history and an even more extraordinary capacity for listening carefully to whoever was speaking to her, a quality I noticed the very first time I met her and have never once seen falter in the more than 25 years since. I liked her immediately, which is not something I say lightly, having watched two of Nathan's earlier, briefer relationships with a far more critical eye. Olivia asked me, the very first time we met, careful and specific questions about my own years teaching piano, not the polite general questions people ask to be seen asking, but real questions about which composers I found hardest to teach and why, about whether I had ever regretted not performing professionally myself. Questions that told me she had actually been listening to Nathan talk about his own family long before she ever met any of us, and had taken the trouble to remember the details. They married 3 years later in a small ceremony at the Roundhouse Gardens, the oldest building in the whole state, standing quietly behind them as they exchanged their vows. And I remember thinking, watching my son's face that afternoon, that I had never seen him look so entirely unguarded, so completely without the careful reserve that even then, in his late 20s, had already begun to be part of how he moved through the world. It is strange, knowing what I know now, to look back at photographs from that wedding day and understand that the careful reserve I noticed even then was not yet the protective silence it would later become. It was simply Nathan's natural quietness, the same quietness his own father carried, a man comfortable inside himself, but never quick to fill a room with unnecessary words. The wedding day. Nathan was a man who had not yet been tested by anything large enough to require the particular kind of silence I would eventually come to recognize in him, and watching him in those photographs now, I find myself grieving, just a little, for the version of my son who still existed before that test arrived, even while I find myself prouder than I have ever been of the version who survived it. Let me bring you back now, to the documents, because there is one piece I have not yet told you about, and it is the piece that finally pushed me from quiet reading into quiet action. Among the photocopied bank statements and the meeting minutes and Emily's careful letter, there was a single property document, considerably older than the rest, its paper a slightly different stock, its formatting belonging to an earlier decade entirely. It was a transfer of title for a small commercial property on Pakenham Street, in the heart of Fremantle's old warehouse district, a building I recognized at once, because I had walked past it 1,000 times in my life. A narrow limestone warehouse with an arched timber door that had, over the decades, housed a chandlery, then a furniture restorer. Then, for a brief period in the 1990s, nothing at all but dust and pigeons. The document showed that property had been transferred, some 30 years ago, from my own late husband's name into a family trust arrangement that I had never once, in 3 decades of marriage, been told existed. Arthur's name was on that document, dated nearly 4 years before he died, in handwriting I recognized at once as belonging to a solicitor whose name meant nothing to me, attached to a covering letter that referenced, briefly and without explanation, an arrangement made to protect family assets during a period the letter described only as a difficult restructuring within the wider Pemberton and Sinclair business interests. I had never heard those 2 family names joined together in any official capacity in my entire life. My father's modest income as a wharf clerk had never, to my knowledge, intersected with any business interest large enough to require a trust arrangement, a solicitor, or a property transfer of any kind. And yet there it was, in black and white, dated decades before the crisis Nathan had quietly weathered, suggesting that whatever I had just spent 2 weeks learning about my son's protective silence was not, in fact, the beginning of this family's pattern of carrying difficult truths alone. It was, very possibly, simply the most recent chapter in a much older one, a chapter that reached all the way back to my own husband, and possibly, given the Pemberton name sitting there on the page in plain ink, all the way back to my own father as well. I sat in my good chair that evening with that single page in my lap for a very long time, the harbor beginning to glow with the lights of evening cargo work down below, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, settling into my chest like a held breath finally released, that I was no longer simply trying to understand what had happened to my son. I was trying to understand what had happened, quietly, invisibly, generously, and at considerable personal cost, across 3 generations of my own family, including, it seemed, generations I had thought I already knew everything about. If you've stayed with me this far, truly stayed, I want you to know how much that means. There is something about telling a story like this slowly, properly, the way it actually happened, rather than rushing toward whatever feels most dramatic, and I am grateful to anyone willing to sit with that pace alongside me. If you would, leave a comment telling me what you think that older document might mean. I'd love to read your guesses before the next part of this story answers them. A like helps more than you'd think, and if you haven't subscribed, please consider it now, because what I found after that property document is what finally brought me to a solicitor's office of my own, determined, for the first time in my long life, to understand my own family's history properly, from the very beginning, rather than simply accepting the comfortable, incomplete version I had quietly believed for decades. I telephoned a solicitor the very next morning, not Nathan's solicitor, and not whoever had drawn up that old trust document 30 years ago, but a younger woman named Priya Anand, recommended to me by my own longtime accountant, a woman whose office sat above a cafe on South Terrace, close enough that I could smell good coffee through her open window while we spoke, and who listened to my entire confused, careful explanation of envelopes and coats and decades-old property transfers with a patience I found, that first morning, almost more reassuring than anything else that had happened since Olivia's hand closed around mine in that doorway. "What you're describing," she said, once I'd finished, "sounds less like anything legally troubling, and more like a family that's been quietly protecting each other from each other's fears for a very long time." I asked her, then, the question I had been turning over for 2 weeks without quite letting myself say it aloud. If a piece of property, or an old arrangement like the one I'd found, had been quietly handled decades ago to protect a family's interests. And nobody now living entirely understood the full shape of what had been protected, or why, or from whom. Was there any way to find out properly? Not to undo anything, not to accuse anyone, but simply, finally, to know. Priya considered the question with the same careful patience she'd shown the whole conversation, then told me something that has stayed with me ever since, something I think matters far beyond my own family's particular story. "There usually is," she said. "It just takes someone willing to actually look. Most families never do, Mrs. Sinclair. Not because the truth is too dangerous to find. Usually, it's simply that everyone assumes someone else already knows it, and so nobody ever actually goes looking. It sounds to me like you might be the first person in this family in 30 years who's decided to go looking properly." I left her office that afternoon with a short list of records offices and archive requests to make, and with a feeling I had not expected to feel at 78 years old. Walking back down South Terrace, past the same cafes I had walked past my whole adult life, the harbor cranes visible in the distance, the way they always have been, the way they likely always will be. I felt, for the first time since that strange afternoon at Olivia's front door, something closer to purpose than fear. Whatever this family had been quietly carrying, across however many decades, I was finally going to understand the whole of it. Properly, from the very beginning. And I had a strong, settled feeling, walking home along that familiar street with the autumn light beginning to soften toward evening, that the rest of my family was about to discover something I had already begun to understand. Sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is carry a difficult truth alone for as long as they possibly can. But truth, in my long experience, does not stay buried forever. It simply waits, patiently, for someone willing enough, or perhaps simply stubborn enough, to finally come looking for it. I telephoned Nathan 3 days after my conversation with Priya Anand on a Thursday morning because I have learned across nearly 8 decades of living that some conversations are better held in daylight, when the body and the voice are both at their steadiest, and this felt very much like a daylight conversation. "I'd like to come by the office," I told him, "just for a cup of tea. Nothing urgent." There was a small pause on the line before he answered, the kind of pause I might once have read as nothing at all, but which I now understood, having spent 2 weeks learning to listen for exactly that sort of silence, as a man quickly calculating something. "Of course, Mum. Come by whenever suits." Lewin Marine Engineering had long since moved out of that single rented room above the chandlery on Cliff Street and into a proper office on the second floor of a converted wool store near the old Fremantle markets, all exposed brick and tall arched windows looking out toward the harbor, the same view, more or less, that Arthur had once guided ships through every working day of his life. Nathan kept a model of that very first balsa wood tugboat on a shelf behind his desk. Sun faded now, one of its little painted funnels chipped, and I noticed, the moment I sat down across from him, that his eyes went to it for a brief moment before they came back to me, as though some part of him already knew this was not, in fact, going to be a conversation about nothing urgent at all. I did not raise my voice. "I want you to understand that because I think there is a particular kind of family story people expect, full of shouting and slammed doors, and that was never going to be the shape of this one, not in my family, not with my son." I simply set Emily's letter on the desk between us, along with the photocopied note in his own handwriting, the one that read better, "They think less of me than lose what they've built." And I asked him, as gently as I knew how, whether he would tell me, finally, properly, what had actually happened 8 years ago. Nathan looked at that single sheet of his own handwriting for a long time before he said anything at all. Long enough that the kettle in the corner of his office finished boiling and clicked itself off, unattended, and neither of us moved to deal with it. "How long have you known?" he said eventually, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than I had heard it in years, quieter even than the careful distance I had grown so used to mistaking for coldness. 2 weeks. Olivia gave me an envelope. I don't think she meant for you to find out I had it quite so soon, but I think, in her heart, she's been hoping someone would finally ask you properly for a very long time. He was quiet again after that, his hands flat on the desk, and I watched something move across his face that I had not seen since he was a much younger man. A kind of unguarding, the same unguarded look I remembered from his wedding day photographs, though this time it carried grief in it rather than joy. "I didn't want any of you carrying it," he said finally. "Caroline had just got the shop renovation underway. You'd only just lost Dad the year before. Olivia's mother was unwell. There was never a good moment to hand everyone a problem that big, Mum. So I just decided not to." "For 8 years," I said. "For 8 years," he agreed, and there was no defiance in it at all, only a tiredness so old it had become simply part of how he held his shoulders. I asked him then the question that had been sitting underneath everything else since I'd found that older property document, the one bearing his father's name and the Pemberton name together, decades before any of this had happened. I asked him if he knew anything about a trust arrangement involving a warehouse on Pakenham Street, set up while his own father was still alive. Nathan went very still. "That's not mine to tell you," he said carefully. "That one's older than me, Mum. I only know about it because I found the paperwork myself, going through Dad's old files after he passed. I never asked you about it because I didn't know how to, without telling you things I wasn't sure were mine to tell." "Whose is it to tell then?" I asked him, and he looked at me for a long moment before he answered. "I think there's a man named Frank Castellan still living out in Bicton. He was Dad's business partner for a short while, a long time before you and Dad married, I believe. I think if anyone's still alive who actually understands the whole of it, it would be him. It is a strange thing at 78 years old to learn that your own late husband, a man you were married to for nearly 50 years, a man whose every habit and silence and small kindness you believed you understood completely, had once had a business partner you had never heard a single word about in your entire marriage. I left Nathan's office that morning without anger, though I will admit to you honestly that I left it with something heavier than I had carried walking in. Not at my son, not anymore. Not once I had heard the plain, weary honesty in his voice. What I carried instead was the unsettling weight of realizing that the story I had walked into 2 weeks earlier was larger and older and reached further back than I had any reason to expect, and that I, a woman who had always quietly believed she knew the full shape of her own life, was only now, in her 80th year nearly, beginning to learn how much of that shape had been carefully, lovingly hidden from her the entire time. A short pause, if you'll permit me, because I find this part of the telling rather difficult, and an old woman occasionally needs a moment to gather herself. If you're still here with me, truly here, I would love to know what you make of this Frank Castellan, a name none of us had ever spoken in this family before that morning in Nathan's office. Leave me a comment with your guess about who he might turn out to be. I read every single one. Truly, I do. And it means more to me than you would think to know there are people out there following along with this old woman's strange, slow unraveling of her own family's history. If you haven't subscribed yet, I would be grateful if you did, because there is still so much more of this story ahead. And I promise you, the man in Bicton is only the beginning of what comes next. I drove out to Bicton 3 days later, on a still, bright morning with almost no wind off the river at all, which is rare enough along that stretch of the Swan that I remember noticing it particularly. The water flat as a tabletop all the way across to the Point Walter sandbar. Frank Castellan lived in a modest brick and tile house 2 streets back from the river, the kind of house built in the 1960s and never substantially altered since, with a neat front garden of native grevilleas, and a wind chime made of old boat fittings hanging from the veranda, gently sounding even in that nearly still air. He was, I would learn, 84 years old, A small, spare man with enormous, careful hands, the hands of someone who had spent a working life doing precise things with rope and rigging and machinery. And when I introduced myself at his front door, telling him I was Arthur Sinclair's widow, something moved across his face that I recognized immediately, because I had seen it on my own face countless times across the years. It was the particular expression of a person encountering, after a very long absence, a piece of their own past they had assumed was finished. "Dorothy," he said, and there was real warmth in the way he said it, though also, underneath the warmth, something more careful. "Goodness, I didn't think I'd ever meet you properly. Arthur talked about you constantly, you know, back when I knew him. Used to say his whole reason for going to sea each day was knowing he'd come home to you of an evening. He made tea in a kitchen that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, though he told me, almost apologetically, that he'd given the habit up nearly 20 years before and simply never managed to air the house out properly since, and we sat together at his kitchen table while he told me, slowly, carefully, with the particular precision of a man choosing each word deliberately, the story of a business he and Arthur had briefly, quietly, run together more than 50 years ago, long before Arthur ever became a harbor pilot. It had been a small ship's chandlery and rigging supply business, the two of them barely into their 20s, set up with a modest loan from my own father, Walter Pemberton, who had believed enough in the two young men to put forward money he genuinely could not afford to risk. Money that represented, Frank told me gently, watching my face carefully as he said it, nearly everything my parents had managed to save across years of careful, frugal living. "The business failed within 18 months, Frank said. Bad luck more than bad judgment, if I'm honest with you. A supplier in Singapore went under owing us stock we'd already paid for, and we simply couldn't recover from it. Not at that size, not that early on. Arthur was devastated. Not for himself, you understand. For your father. He felt he'd taken an old man's life savings and thrown them away on a venture that should have worked and simply didn't." I sat very still at that kitchen table, the tea going cold in front of me for what felt like the third time in as many weeks. And I asked Frank the only question that mattered to me in that moment. My father never once, in his whole life, spoke of losing any money to my husband. They got on famously, right up until Dad passed. There was never a hint of trouble between them. Frank nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting exactly that response. "That's because Arthur paid it all back," he said simply. "Every penny, plus a fair bit more besides, across the better part of 15 years, quietly, in cash, handed to your father directly, framed each time. Your father told me once when our paths crossed years later, as an early inheritance, a gift, never as a repayment. Arthur didn't want your father carrying the shame of having lost the money in the first place, and he certainly didn't want you ever knowing the business had failed at all. He told me, the very last time I saw him, must be 25 years ago now at least, that the kindest thing a man could do for the people he loved most was let them believe the difficult years had simply never happened. I want to tell you honestly that I did not cry in Frank Castellan's kitchen that morning, though I came very close. What I felt instead, sitting there with the wind chime sounding faintly outside and the river lying flat and silver beyond his back fence, was something closer to a kind of vertigo, the sensation of an entire floor of my own life quietly shifting beneath me, revealing rooms I had never known existed underneath the one I had spent 50 years standing in. My husband had spent 15 years of our marriage quietly repaying a debt I never knew existed. To a father who never told me he'd been owed anything at all, so that I would never have to know either of the two men I loved most in the world had ever failed at anything, or ever struggled, or ever needed forgiving for a mistake either one had made. And his own son, decades later, faced with a different collapse, a different debt, a different fear of being seen to have failed the people he loved, had done precisely, exactly, heartbreakingly, the same thing. I drove home from Bicton that afternoon along the river road with the windows down, despite the cool air, because I needed, very badly, to feel something moving against my skin while my mind worked through what I had just learned. And I found myself laughing once, a single short, astonished laugh that had grief curled up somewhere inside it too, at the sheer, quiet stubbornness of the men in my family. 3 generations of them now, as far as I could tell. Each one apparently convinced that love meant carrying difficulty entirely alone, that protection meant silence, that the kindest gift a person could give the people they loved was the gift of never having to know how frightened or how close to ruin or how genuinely human their protector had actually been underneath the calm surface they presented every single day. I want to take a moment here, because I think this part of the story deserves it, to say something about what I'd actually begun to understand, sitting in my car on that quiet river road. This was never, I realized, a story about deception in the way that word usually frightens us. Nobody in my family had ever lied to hurt anyone. What had happened instead, across 3 generations now, was a kind of inherited belief, passed down without anyone ever quite naming it out loud, that strength looked like silence, and that love sometimes required a person to carry an unbearable weight rather than ask for help carrying it. I do not think that belief is unique to my family. I suspect, if you are listening to this story tonight, you may know exactly what I mean, perhaps from your own father or your own mother, or your own quiet, careful self. I think there is a particular kind of person, perhaps a particular kind of generation, who learned somewhere along the way that protecting the people you love means never letting them see you struggle. And I have come, across these last weeks of my own life, to believe that this belief, however well-intentioned, however genuinely loving in its origin, very often does more harm across a family than the original difficulty it was trying to hide ever could have done on its own. If that's resonating with you at all tonight, I would love to hear it in the comments, truly. Tell me about someone in your own family who carried something alone for far too long, and what it felt like once you finally understood the whole of it. These stories matter more to me when I know real lives are sitting alongside them. A like helps this story travel to someone else who might need to hear it tonight, and if you haven't yet subscribed, I would be glad if you did, because what comes next in this family's story is the part where all of this finally, properly, comes together around a single table. I telephoned Caroline in Albany that same evening, the first time in longer than I cared to admit that I had called my daughter simply to talk rather than to confirm a date or a detail for some upcoming family occasion, and I told her everything. The envelope, Nathan's office, Frank Castellan's kitchen table, her own bookshop renovation, and the loan she had spent a decade believing came from a council scheme that, as it turned out, had never existed in the form she remembered it. There was a long silence on the line after I finished, long enough that I asked her gently if she was still there. "I'm here," she said, and her voice, when it came, was thick in a way I had not heard from my daughter since she was a much younger woman. "Mum, I sent that council scheme a thank you card, an actual card. I remember writing it. I addressed it to a department that I genuinely cannot remember the name of now, and I never once thought to question why nobody ever wrote back." "Nathan didn't want you to feel you owed him anything," I said. "I think, looking back over all of this now, that's been the one consistent thread running through every single piece of it. Not one of these men ever wanted to be thanked. They only ever wanted the people they loved to feel safe, and to never feel the particular weight of having been saved by someone close enough to them that the saving itself might cost something between them." Caroline was quiet again for a moment, and then she said something that has stayed with me ever since. Something I think gets right to the very heart of this whole story. "That's not actually kindness, Mum. Not all the way through, anyway. It's kindness with a door locked on one side of it. He decided for me what I was allowed to feel grateful for. I never got the chance to actually thank my own brother for saving my shop. He took that choice away from me, even while he was busy saving me." I sat with that thought for a long time after I hung up the phone that evening, looking out at the harbor lights coming on one by one along the breakwater, because I think Caroline had said, more clearly and more honestly than I had yet managed to say it myself, exactly what had been troubling me underneath all the grief and gratitude and astonishment of the last few weeks. Protection, when it is total, when it allows no questions and demands no acknowledgement and leaves the people being protected with no choice in the matter at all, stops being entirely a gift. It becomes, however lovingly intended, a kind of quiet decision made on someone else's behalf about what they are strong enough to bear. And I had begun to understand that the next, and perhaps hardest, part of this story was not going to be about uncovering any more secrets at all. It was going to be about finding a way, finally, after 3 generations of careful silence, to gather every member of this family in a single room and give them all, for the first time, the chance to choose for themselves what they were ready to know and to carry and to forgive. I did not call the gathering myself in the end. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to how the rest of this unfolded. It was Emily who suggested it, 3 days after I telephoned her directly for the first time since reading her letter, a conversation I had been quietly dreading and quietly longing for in equal measure. She had answered on the second ring, her voice careful, clearly bracing herself for whatever I might say, and when I told her simply that I had read every page of what she'd sent, and that I understood now why she had felt she had no choice but to send it, she had been quiet for a long moment before she said, very softly, "I didn't know what else to do, Nan. I'd known for almost a year, and I couldn't carry it by myself anymore, and I didn't think I had the right to tell Mum or Dad how to feel about something I'd found by accident in a box they'd asked me to help sort." I told her she had done exactly the right thing, and I meant it, fully, without reservation. And I think that was the moment something in my granddaughter finally allowed itself to settle, because the next thing she said, in a voice with real steadiness returning to it, was, "Nan, I think everyone needs to actually sit down together, properly. Not another careful family dinner where everyone talks around things. An actual conversation, with everything finally on the table." She was right, of course, and I told her so, and I told her something else as well, something I had been turning over since that long evening in my car on the river road. I told her that I thought it should happen at my house, on Ellen Street, in the same dining room where this family had eaten Sunday dinners together for 50 years, because I had come to believe, across these strange weeks, that some truths need to be spoken in rooms that already hold enough love inside their walls to absorb whatever difficulty arrives alongside them. We set the date for the following Sunday. I telephoned Nathan myself and told him plainly, without softening it at all, that Emily and I both believed it was time the whole family sat down together and finally said out loud the things that had been carried quietly and separately for far too long. I expected resistance. I had, after all, watched this particular pattern of careful protective silence pass through 3 generations of men in this family, and I had no real reason to believe Nathan would simply set it aside because his mother and his daughter asked him to. But he surprised me, the way he had begun surprising me ever since that morning in his office with the kettle clicking off unattended behind us. "I think I'm tired, Mum," he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. "I think I've been tired for about 8 years, if I'm honest with you, and I didn't let myself notice it because I was too busy making sure nobody else had to feel any of it." Olivia, when I telephoned her separately, simply said, "Thank you," twice, quietly, and I understood, hearing it, that she had been waiting for this exact gathering for longer than any of us had realized. Perhaps since the very afternoon she'd pressed that envelope into my coat pocket with hands that would not stop shaking. Before I tell you about that Sunday, though, I want to tell you about something I did in the days leading up to it, because I think it matters, and because I think it explains why, when that family finally did gather around my dining table, the conversation that followed was able to be as gentle and as honest, and ultimately as healing as it turned out to be. I went back to see Priya Anand, the solicitor, one final time, and I asked her to help me put together, as plainly and clearly as the records allowed, A simple, complete timeline. Not an accusation. Not a legal document of any consequence at all, really, beyond the modest administrative matter of confirming that the old Pakenham Street trust arrangement was correctly filed and that nothing in our family's various overlapping arrangements posed any actual risk to anyone's inheritance or ownership going forward, which Priya was able to confirm within a single straightforward search of the relevant title's office records. But beyond that small, necessary piece of housekeeping, what I asked her to help me create was something gentler. A simple written record, just for the family, setting out plainly, in chronological order, exactly what had happened. My father's original loan to two young men barely into their 20s, the Chandlerys' failure. Arthur's 15 years of quiet repayment, framed always as gifts rather than debts. The Pakenham Street Trust, set up not, as it turned out, from any crisis at all, but simply as the eventual modest fruit of that long repayment, a small commercial property Arthur had purchased once the debt was finally settled, placed quietly into trust for the wider family, precisely so that no single person would ever again carry alone the full weight of an asset that had originally been built from one man's quiet, 15-year act of repair. And finally, Nathan's own crisis, 8 years past now, the company's near collapse, the careful restructuring that had protected Caroline's bookshop and several smaller family interests. Besides all of it, finally, laid out plainly on paper, dates and figures and decisions, without judgment, simply so that everyone gathering around my table that Sunday would have the same complete picture in front of them, rather than each person holding only their own small, partial piece of a much larger story. I want to pause here, before I tell you about that Sunday itself, because I think there's something worth saying about why I felt that simple written timeline mattered so much. I have come to believe, across these strange recent weeks of my long life, that families very often do not fall apart because of the difficult things that happen to them. They fall apart slowly and quietly because everyone involved ends up holding a different, partial version of the same story. And over enough years, those partial versions drift far enough apart from each other that the people holding them stop being able to recognize the same family in each other's accounts of it at all. If you found yourself nodding along to that thought, even slightly, I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments tonight. Has your own family ever discovered, the way mine did, that everyone had been holding a different piece of the very same story for years without realizing it? I read every comment, and I promise you, hearing from people living through their own versions of this has meant more to me these last weeks than I can properly say. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because that Sunday around my dining table is very nearly here in this telling, and I do not want you to miss a single moment of it. The Sunday arrived bright and clear, one of those late autumn Fremantle days where the light comes in low and gold across the limestone. And by 4 o'clock that afternoon, my dining room, the same room where I had fed this family for 50 years, held every single one of them at once for the first time in longer than I could comfortably remember. Nathan and Olivia sat together near the window, Olivia's hands, I noticed immediately, entirely steady now, resting easily on the table in front of her, rather than knotted in her lap the way I imagined they must have been for months. Emily sat beside her mother, a folder of her own notes in front of her that she did not, in the end, need to open even once, because the conversation that followed needed no prompting from anyone. Caroline had driven the 4 hours up from Albany that morning, arriving with a basket of second-hand books for me, an old habit of hers I have always loved, and she sat across from her brother with an expression I had not seen on her face in years, something between old hurt and new, careful tenderness. Frank Castellan, whom I had invited myself, after a good deal of careful thought, sat near the head of the table, the only person present who had known this family's very oldest chapter firsthand, his enormous, careful hands folded quietly in front of him. I had laid out Priya's timeline at each place setting, simple printed pages, nothing elaborate, and I watched, over the course of that long Sunday afternoon, as each member of my family read through a story that was, in pieces, already theirs, but that none of them, until that very afternoon, had ever seen laid out complete and whole. There was no shouting at that table. I want to be entirely honest with you about that, because I know it is not always how families behave when difficult truths finally surface, and I am grateful every single day since that mine behaved exactly as it did. What there was, instead, was a long, careful unfolding. Nathan spoke first, his voice low and steady, about the months he had spent 8 years ago lying awake beside Olivia, doing arithmetic in his head that never once came out right, and the morning he had finally decided, alone in his car outside the wool store office before anyone else had arrived for the day, that he would simply absorb whatever the collapse cost, however much that turned out to be, rather than let it touch a single other person in this family. Caroline spoke next, quietly at first, and then with more feeling than I think she had expected to find in herself, about 10 years of believing she owed her shop's survival to a faceless counsel program, and about how strange and how oddly grief filled it felt to learn, only now, that the person she actually owed it to had been sitting across from her at every single family dinner since, saying nothing, asking for nothing, simply watching her thrive in a business he had quietly saved and never once claiming a single ounce of credit for having done it. Olivia spoke after that, and what she told us, finally, in a voice that broke only once, was that she had known the full truth for nearly 3 years, having found a stray document of her own one evening while helping Nathan reorganize his home office, and that she had carried the secret of his secret for all that time, watching him grow quieter and more distant with every passing year under a weight she desperately wanted to help him put down, but did not feel it was hers to expose on his behalf. It was, she told us, watching Emily slowly piece together the very same story independently, going through those archive boxes for an entirely unrelated reason, that had finally convinced her the secret had simply grown too large and too heavy for any one person, however willing, to keep carrying alone any longer. "I put that envelope in your coat pocket," she said, looking directly at me, "because I didn't have the courage to tell you myself, Dorothy. But I knew, somehow, that if anyone in this family was capable of carrying the truth properly, gently, without it breaking anything that mattered, it would be you. I will admit to you now, telling you this part of the story, that I had to set my own page down for a moment at that point in the conversation, because there are certain kindnesses, certain quiet expressions of trust that arrive at exactly the moment in a person's life when they most need to hear them, and that was, without question, one of those moments for me. Frank Castellan spoke last, and what he offered the table that afternoon was something none of the rest of us could have given, which was simple, lived perspective from outside the immediate family, the voice of a man who had watched, more than 50 years earlier, the very first link in this whole long chain of quiet protection form between 2 young men in a failing chandlery business, long before any of the people now sitting at that table had even been born. "Your husband," he said to me gently, "was the kindest man I ever did business with, and also, I'll say honestly, the most stubborn. He could not stand the idea of anyone he loved feeling small because of something that had gone wrong. I think, watching all of you tonight, that stubbornness simply found its way down through the family, generation after generation, each one of you trying, in your own way, to spare the others exactly what Arthur once spared your grandfather. We did not solve everything that single Sunday afternoon. I want to be honest about that too, because I think a story like this one owes its listeners honesty more than it owes them a tidy ending. There were tears at that table, and there were long silences that needed to be sat through rather than filled. And there were, even by the time the evening finally settled in and the harbor lights began coming on below my window, several questions that nobody in that room felt entirely ready yet to answer, including, perhaps most significantly of all, the question of how this family intended to behave differently going forward, now that the old pattern of protective silence had finally, properly, been named out loud for what it actually was. But there was something else at that table, too, something I had not expected to feel quite so strongly. Sitting at the head of it, the way I had sat at the head of family dinners in that very room for 50 years. There was relief. Real, physical relief. The kind that settles into a body the way warmth settles into cold hands held finally near a fire. Every single person gathered around that table had spent years, in some cases decades, carrying a partial, isolating version of a story that, it turned out, every other person in the room had also been carrying their own partial version of, all of them separately exhausted by exactly the same weight, none of them realizing, until that single Sunday afternoon, how much lighter that weight became the moment it was finally, properly, shared. If you've made it this far with me, truly, this far, sitting through every twist and quiet revelation of this long family afternoon, I want you to know how grateful this old woman is for your company. There is still more of this story left to tell, more of what happened in the weeks following that Sunday, more of what this family chose to do with the truth once they finally all held the whole of it together. And I promise you, the way it ends is worth every minute you've spent with me so far. If you haven't yet, please do leave a comment. Tell me which member of this family you found yourself understanding the most by the end of that dinner table conversation. And if this story has been good company for you tonight, a like and a subscription would mean more to me than I can properly say. Stay with me a little longer. There is one more part of this family's story still to come, and I think, when you hear how it closes, you'll understand why I needed to tell you all of it properly, from the very beginning, rather than rushing toward an ending that hadn't yet earned itself. 6 months passed before I felt the shape of this story properly settle, the way a house settles after a renovation, all its small creaks and unfamiliar silences gradually becoming simply the sound of a home being lived in again. It is autumn once more as I tell you this final part, the same season in which the whole of it began, and there is something I find rather moving in that, the way a year can turn itself all the way around and bring you back, gently, to where you started, except that you are no longer the same person who stood there the first time. I still live in the same limestone cottage on Ellen Street. I still hang my coats on the same peg by the door, and I will admit to you that I have never once, in the months since, walked past that peg without my eyes going briefly to the pocket of that gray wool coat, remembering the particular weight of an envelope I did not yet understand the importance of. Sunday dinners look different now, and I want to tell you carefully how they look different, because I think the difference matters more than any dramatic ending ever could. Nathan comes earlier than he used to, most weeks, sometimes a full hour before the meal itself, and he no longer sits slightly apart from the table the way he did for the better part of a decade. He talks now, properly, about the business, about decisions he is weighing, about a difficult new contract he very nearly turned down last month out of an old familiar instinct to protect everyone from the risk of it, before catching himself, telling Olivia, and then 2 days later, telling the rest of us as well, simply because he has decided, deliberately, that the family he loves deserves the chance to worry alongside him occasionally, rather than only ever being handed the finished, tidy version of whatever has already been resolved. Olivia's hands, I am glad to tell you, have not trembled once since that afternoon at her front door. She told me, not long ago, sitting together on my veranda with a pot of tea between us, that she had spent nearly 3 years carrying her own quiet half of Nathan's secret, and that the trembling I noticed that day had not, in the end, been fear of what the envelope might do to the family. It had been the simple, overwhelming relief of finally, after 3 years, being able to put a weight down into someone else's hands. "I didn't know if you'd be angry with me," she said, "for choosing you, of all people, to hand it to." I told her honestly that I had never once in 6 months felt anger toward her, only a deep and lasting gratitude, because she had trusted an old woman with something enormous, and that trust, more than any single document in that envelope, was what had finally allowed our whole family to find its way back to itself. Caroline drives up from Albany more often now, not every week. The 4 hours each way is simply too much to ask of anyone too regularly, but more than she used to. And there is an ease between her and Nathan now that I had genuinely begun to believe, before all of this, was simply gone from their relationship for good, worn away by years and distance and lives that had quietly drifted in different directions. They speak now. When they speak, like siblings who actually know each other, rather than like two adults performing the polite, careful fondness of people who share a childhood but very little else anymore. Caroline finally found the chance, 3 months ago, to thank her brother properly, in person, at this very table, for the loan she had spent a decade believing came from somewhere else entirely. And I watched Nathan's face while she did it, watched him try, out of old habit, to deflect the gratitude, to say it was nothing truly, before stopping himself, taking a breath, and simply saying instead, "You're welcome, Caro. I'm glad I could help you keep it." 2 small sentences, and yet I do not think I have ever been prouder of my son in his entire life than I was in that exact moment, prouder than any business success or any quiet act of sacrifice. Because what he managed, finally, was something far harder for a man like Nathan than carrying a burden alone had ever been. He let himself be thanked. Emily has changed too, in her own quieter way. She finished organizing those old archive boxes some months ago, the very ones that started all of this. And she told me recently that she has decided to go back and study archival science properly, formally, something she had apparently been quietly considering for years without ever feeling she had a good enough reason to actually pursue it. I asked her gently whether this whole strange, difficult business of uncovering her family's old secrets was what had finally pushed her toward that decision. And she thought about it for a long moment before she answered me honestly, the way she always has. "I think I always loved old paper and old stories more than I let myself admit, Nan. But finding out that the truth in those boxes actually mattered, that it actually changed something real for real people I love, that's what made me brave enough to stop treating it like a hobby and start treating it like a life. There is a particular kind of joy I have found in watching a young person discover, through difficulty, exactly what they are meant to do with the rest of their life. And I think Emily's letter, the one that began this whole story, the one I read in my good chair with the harbor fog still sitting low outside my window, may turn out to have been the very first piece of serious archival work of her entire career, though I doubt she would describe it in quite such grand terms herself. Frank Castellan, I am glad to tell you, has become something of a regular presence at our family table now too. He is 84 years old and walks with a stick these days, though his enormous, careful hands remain as steady as ever when he is telling a story about Arthur as a young man, stories none of us, not even I, had ever heard before that long Sunday afternoon. He told us, only a few weeks ago, over a slice of lemon cake made from the very tree Arthur planted the year Nathan was born, that he had spent more than 50 years believing he was the only person left alive who remembered the young, frightened, generous man Arthur had been before any of us ever knew him, and that being welcomed back into this family's table, after all that time, felt to him like finally being allowed to put down a different kind of loneliness altogether. One he had carried so long he had stopped noticing the weight of it at all. I think about that often now, Frank's particular loneliness, the loneliness of being the last living witness to a chapter of someone's life that everyone else has long since forgotten ever happened. I think about how close that chapter came to disappearing entirely, lost the moment Frank himself eventually passed, the way so many family truths simply vanish, not through any deliberate act of hiding, but through the ordinary, accumulating silence of time, one generation forgetting to ask the questions the previous generation never thought to answer. That thought brings me, I think, to the heart of what I actually want to leave you with tonight, because I have come to believe, across these strange and difficult and ultimately healing months, that this story was never really about envelopes or old property documents, or even about the particular sums of money that passed quietly between 3 generations of careful, well-meaning men. It was about something far simpler than any of that, and far more universal too, something I suspect very nearly every family carries some version of, whether or not they ever happen to find an envelope of their own. We tell ourselves so often that love means shielding the people we care about from difficulty. That strength looks like silence, and that the kindest thing we can do for someone we love is to carry their share of a burden quietly, without ever letting them feel its weight at all. I believed that for most of my own life, watching my own mother serve smaller portions during a hard winter rather than ever once telling her children there wasn't enough. I watched my husband carry a debt for 15 years rather than let my father feel the shame of having lost his savings. I watched my own son very nearly disappear into himself for a decade, mistaken by every single person who loved him for a man who had simply grown cold, when in truth he had only ever grown quiet under the weight of trying to save every one of us from a danger we never even knew had come close enough to touch us. And I have come to believe, finally, sitting now in my 80th year with this whole long story properly understood at last, that this particular kind of love, however genuine, however deeply felt, however well-intentioned in every single instance across 3 generations of my own family, carries within it a quiet, almost invisible cost that very rarely gets spoken of honestly. It is the cost of taking away, from the very people you are trying hardest to protect, the chance to actually show up for you in return. Every time Arthur quietly repaid my father without ever letting him know there was a debt to repay, he denied my father the chance to forgive him for an honest mistake made by a young man simply trying his best. Every time Nathan quietly absorbed an entire business collapse without telling a single one of us, he denied his own mother, his own sister, his own wife, the chance to stand beside him through something difficult, the chance that every one of them, I now firmly believe, would have taken gladly had he only allowed them the dignity of choosing it for themselves. Protection that leaves no room for the people you love to actually participate in being there for you is not, in the end, entirely protection at all. It is a kind of quiet, well-meaning loneliness, dressed up so carefully in the language of love that it can take an entire family, 3 generations, and 1 forgotten coat to finally notice it for what it really is. I do not say any of this with judgment toward any of the men in my own family, and I want that to be entirely clear to you, because every single one of them, my father, my husband, my son, acted in their own time out of a love so large and so genuine that it simply did not know how to ask for help carrying itself. I understand that instinct completely, because I have lived inside it my own entire life, and I suspect, if I am honest with you, that there have been moments across my own 80 years when I too quietly carried something difficult alone rather than risk letting the people I loved feel the smallest portion of its weight. But I think now, finally, at the far end of this long story, that the bravest thing any of us can do for the people we love is not always to carry their burdens silently on their behalf. Sometimes the braver, harder, far more generous act is to let them see us struggling, to let them ask us how they can help, to give them the dignity of choosing, for themselves, to show up for someone they love, rather than discovering decades later, the way my own family did, that they had been quietly denied that chance the entire time, without ever even knowing there had been a chance to deny. That, I think, is the truest lesson this whole strange chapter of my life has taught me. And I offer it to you now, gently, the way I would offer it across a kitchen table to anyone willing to sit with me long enough to hear it properly. If there is someone in your own life carrying something quietly, someone who has grown a little distant, a little careful, a little harder to read than they used to be, it may not mean what you fear it means. It may simply mean they are carrying a weight they have convinced themselves they are not allowed to set down in front of you. And if that is true, the kindest thing you might ever do for them is not to wait for an envelope of your own to arrive one day, smuggled into the pocket of a forgotten coat, but to ask them, gently, honestly, today, whether there is something heavier than they are letting on, and to tell them plainly that you are strong enough and that you love them enough to help them carry it. I want to take a moment now, before I bring this whole long story to its proper close, to thank you, truly and from the bottom of an old woman's heart, for staying with me through every part of it. I know this has been a long story to sit with, longer perhaps than many you have spent your evenings on, and I am deeply grateful that you chose to spend this particular stretch of time in the company of my family, my son, my daughter, my granddaughter, my late husband, and an old chandlery owner named Frank Castellan, who waited more than 50 years to be welcomed back to a family table. If this story has meant something to you tonight, I would be so glad if you left a comment telling me so, perhaps about a quiet, careful person in your own life you might look at a little differently now, or perhaps simply about which part of this long family unraveling moved you the most. I read every single comment, truly, and they mean more to this old woman than you could possibly know. If you have enjoyed sitting with this story, I would be deeply grateful for a like, and if you have not yet subscribed, please do, because there will be more stories like this one, more families, more quiet secrets finally brought gently into the light, and I would be honored to have your company again. And if you know someone, a friend, a parent, a sibling, who might need to hear a story exactly like this one tonight, I would ask you, gently, to share it with them, because you never quite know which story is going to be the one that finally gives someone the courage to ask the people they love what they have really been carrying. Let me close now, the way I began, with that gray wool coat, because I think it deserves one final mention before I let you go. I hung it back in my hallway wardrobe the very evening I first read Emily's letter, and it has hung there ever since, through every part of this long story I have told you, through Frank Castellan's kitchen table and Priya Anand's careful office above the cafe on South Terrace, and that long, quiet Sunday afternoon around my own dining table with my whole family finally gathered together. I wore it again only last week, on a cold, clear morning, walking down to the harbor the way I have walked nearly every morning of my adult life, past the old round house, standing exactly where it has stood since 1831, past the same cranes Arthur once guided ships beneath, past the wool store where my son now sits at a desk with a faded balsa wood tugboat on the shelf behind him, no longer carrying his burdens entirely alone. I had gone to Olivia's house that afternoon 6 months ago, believing I had only forgotten a coat. I understand now, fully, completely, the way you only ever understand the largest truths of your own life once you have lived all the way through to the other side of them, that I had actually left behind, that evening, something far more valuable than any coat could ever be. I had left behind the chance to understand, properly and completely, the people I loved most in this world, before time, the quietest and most patient thief any of us ever face, could carry their unspoken truths away from me forever, the way it so very nearly did. I do not know what is waiting in your own family, in your own quiet rooms, in your own careful, distant, beloved relatives who have grown harder to read than they used to be. But I hope, if nothing else, that this old woman's strange and unexpected unraveling of her own family's 3 generations of careful, loving silence has given you something worth carrying with you tonight. Ask the people you love what they are really holding. Give them the chance to set it down in front of you. And remember always that the truest measure of love in any family is not how much we manage to shield each other from, but how willing we finally become to stand beside one another in the very middle of it. Thank you truly for spending this time with me and with the Sinclair family of Fremantle, Western Australia. If this story found its way to you tonight, please leave a comment to let me know you were here. Give it a like if it moved you even a little. Subscribe if you would like to walk alongside another family's quiet unraveling very soon. And share it onward to anyone who might need exactly this kind of evening. Take good care of the people you love, and take even better care of the quiet ones among them. Good night. From an old woman in Fremantle, and from the whole of the Sinclair family, with more gratitude than words can properly hold.